Hello everyone, this is Ohio Dan. I wanted to make a video where I express kind of a different point of view on a topic that I've seen discussed many times, which is the idea that there is nothing new under the sun. And I may have kind of a controversial opinion on this because I seem to be in the minority view that actually the idea that there's nothing new under the sun does not fully explain what we're seeing today. I think that there's a limitation to this idea, and that a lot of what we're seeing actually is kind of new in a way. Not in the overall sense that history isn't cyclical or doesn't repeat itself, but in the sense that the way things are presented today is kind of brand new, at least in certain ways. So I've often heard in response to a changing society and developing problems across the world that we're not actually seeing anything new, and that civilizations will simply rise and fall in such a manner as they always have. That after a period of time, the civilization gets too comfortable or they've had a lot of success, they no longer have the attributes that were necessary to achieve that success in the first place, and so other groups of people, other civilizations and societies rise and replace those that were once great before them. And also not just on a civilizational timescale, but also in terms of economies going through cycles or the nature of how people get along or fail to get along, that these things all are basically what we've seen before. It's just that we may not be consciously aware of past events that were the same as what we're seeing now. But honestly, again, I'm critical of this theory. I'm not totally on board with that. While in a sense, everything that I've been saying about nothing new under the sun is true, and an overall, again, looking at history, looking at civilizations rising and falling, in that sense, it may be true as it applies to human nature and the collapse of empires being similar or being cyclical over time. I think the formulation in place today is something new. I think a lot of the challenges that we face, a lot of the things that we see are at an unprecedented level, and just saying, well, it's nothing different than what happened before, and sure, societies may have collapsed, and we may have had dark ages, you may have had the Bronze Age collapse, or the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the Dark Age after that, but we'll go through that, and everything will end up kind of going through a cycle, and civilization and humankind, so to speak, will rise again. I'm not completely sure that's the case. I think what we're seeing today is new because even though the core of human nature remains constant and history may be cyclical, we're facing a combination of elements in current times that I think is unprecedented in many key ways. The world has 8 billion people living on it now. That goes so far beyond any level of population that has existed throughout history. And globalization and interconnectivity are at unprecedented levels. The level of technology that we have today is so far well and beyond anything we've had in the past that we're aware of, at least, that to act like, well, we've invented certain things over time, right? The Roman Empire had certain things that you didn't have in the Iron Age or during the Egyptian period of dominance. That might be true, but is it really anything compared to what we have today with cars driving themselves and all the things from the Industrial Revolution on, really? Within just a very short period of time, we have developed so many new technologies and have seen globalization rise beyond what you had during the kind of golden age before the Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean and in Egypt. Sure, those countries were interconnected, but that may have been unprecedented at that point in time, but it's still nothing like what we see today, in my opinion. And everyone's trying to keep up, where society and the way things are run is so not really just a matter of human nature anymore. It's not a matter of just living in the natural world. We live in almost an artificial reality at this point. We're headed toward things that are just totally unprecedented and don't have a reference in history, in my opinion. You can talk about how you've had these advances in technology in the past, but just what we've got going on today with the internet and with having so many people in these urbanized areas. Sure, again, you had highly populated areas in the past, but nothing like the numbers that we see today. And it's just off the charts. And to say that, well, it was off the chart from the perspective of the Roman people, or off the charts from the perspective of people that lived in Egyptian or Sumerian population centers. It doesn't matter what civilization you look at. I just think that what we have going on today goes so far beyond that it's not really the same type of thing. It's a totally different beast, in my opinion. We now have the power to easily destroy and wipe out all life on the world's surface with some of the technology that we've developed. People are struggling with environmental factors that don't really seem to have been present at any time in the past, or at least not in the same dosages. The inability for men and women to get along, for example, that certainly has happened in the past. I'm not trying to be naive to different times where women's tendency to put themselves first above family has not been utilized and exploited by the powers that be. I'm sure that has happened. You can find evidence of that. But at the level where, honestly, you've got this sort of fake monogamy and hookup culture everywhere, and average guys really have no incentive because they can't have a family. I get that monogamy was not a thing throughout most of history as well, at least in its current form that we're supposed to buy into today. But at the same time, this clusterfuck of things being so out of sequence, and things like lifelike dolls that people will make of the opposite gender, do we really know where that's going to lead? Is there really an example of how that type of thing has existed in the past for men and for women, where the state apparatus basically was in place to force men collectively to take care of women so that women didn't actually need men individually? That, to some extent, probably did take place. But at the level that we see today, where you just have this complete lack of discord with human nature, this complete lack of being on the same page with what we naturally, instinctively want to do as humans. Yes, it's good to develop beyond just our instincts and to have control over the choices that we make based on our biology, based on the environment being so against you, especially if you're a man, that you don't want to make a decision just based on your instincts. But things have gotten so far removed from that state of nature that I'm not sure that there's anything like that in the past that we've confronted. I'm not sure that there's anything that has created so much disillusionment with the system and with everyday life like what we see in modern Western society today. I'm sure that you had urban environments where things seemed hopeless, of course, but not quite in the same way. Not in terms of having all this technology, but that technology being used against people in many ways to where, again, men and women can't really get together effectively. You have this sort of dual system where certain laws apply to men only, pretty much, and then other laws apply to men and to women. I'm not convinced that that's the same that we've seen in the past. I know that you could talk about the recent past and how things have been heading this way for quite some time, but I'm talking about more in the distant past. I'm talking about before America existed, the United States existed. I'm talking about before the Enlightenment movement to a large extent. I don't think you can go back in history and actually find examples of some of the things that I've mentioned here. And the level of global interconnectivity and this manipulation of people's biological and just general life desires and goals, I don't think we see that throughout all of history at the level that we have today, using technology, using the interconnectivity, using electronics, social media. Did we really have a thing like social media in the past? Is that nothing new? It looks to me like it's something that's almost brand new, that's really unprecedented, that you can't really compare to anything in the past. So, while the underlying dynamics at play may be the same overall in terms of human nature, people are what they are and what they've always been, and in that sense, there might not be anything new under the sun. I don't think the applications we see now can be compared to prior times. I don't think a lot of the social phenomenon that we see now really have a precedent, really have a history where you can say, well, in the Roman Empire or in the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance, things were like this. I think things are much different in many key ways. As a result of what I'm pointing out here, some of the outcomes we see as the world continues to unravel in many ways, especially in Western society, may be unpredictable and chaotic in a way that isn't easily comparable to past events. I don't think we can just look at history to say that we know how things are going to turn out, other than overall people are going to continue to have their base desires and society will continue to decline, probably, in the West, and other societies will rise. Civilization will continue to go through its cycle unless we pretty much wipe out all life on Earth, which is a possibility. That's a possibility that we didn't have in the past. Not realistically, not before the nuclear age, the atomic age. And now it's probably actually worse in many ways. I think that a lot of the things we see are, at least in the way they're formulated, at least in the way they're put together, pretty much brand new phenomenon. So I'm not convinced, guys, that the concept of nothing new under the sun does a satisfactory job of predicting the future or describing how the human species will cope with how events will unfold at this point. I don't think we can just rely on that as sort of a way to soothe ourselves and say, well, good times create weak men and weak men create bad times. And yes, that's still true, but it doesn't really explain the things that I see people trying to explain away by making those kinds of statements. I don't think it answers the question of where we're actually headed. What is the decline going to continue to look like? What will collapse look like when we reach a point of no return? For example, when the United States totally defaults on its debt, or when the population replacement rate is so low and poor that the native populations are totally getting displaced, which we're already seeing in this environment, right? These things are already happening, but as the decline gets worse, how are people going to respond in this highly tech-addicted, electronics-addicted, interconnected, woven world that we have? How are things going to pan out? Well, it's just nothing new under the sun, Dan. I don't think that is sufficient anymore at this point. I think that there are things that are going to happen that are going to be unprecedented because the events that we see today are unprecedented, at least in several key ways. The disillusionment, the sort of beaten down, downtrodden type of result that we see today, especially from younger men, but really for people in general. How are we going to overcome that? I know that phenomenon in itself has been a recurring event, that people have always struggled, but now people are struggling and there doesn't seem to be a plan of action. There doesn't seem to be a way to overcome things, not just because of the natural elements, like, oh, your crop yield didn't come in and now you're going to starve. That's really bad, and that we've seen happen many times in the past. But now it's also, even if you have your needs met at a basic level, your core needs, how do you socialize? How do you afford to buy groceries? How do you afford to do many things? And again, things like devaluing the currency, of course, that's happened in the past. But the specific combination of technology, interconnectivity, men versus women, the level of destruction that we're capable of unleashing on the world today, the ruling class using all this technology to try to maintain its power, I don't know that this specific formulation has ever been in place. I don't know that all these events have precedent in history. I think that we need to watch out for these sort of new formulations, because I don't believe that just saying that all these things have happened in the past and there's nothing new under the sun, I don't think that's sufficient at this point. I think we have to watch out for things that we probably can't predict just by looking at the past. And I think we need to be on guard against a variety of outcomes that may be unpleasant in many ways if things continue to go the way that they are with the decline of our society at this point. I don't think we can just predict everything based on what's happened in the past and based on this idea that nothing new could be happening today. I think some of it is new. And I think we need to be aware of that and the limitations of just believing that, well, if certain events have taken place in the past and that's what's going to happen in the future, I don't think it's going to be that simple anymore.